morning, everyone. Today, it's a great pleasure to welcome Stefan Pauer. He's a climate and energy expert and a senior analyst at Clean Energy Canada here in Vancouver or in Burnaby at the Simon Fraser University. And before joining Clean Energy Canada, he has carried out interdisciplinary research on carbon pricing in California and Europe at the University of British Columbia, also at Vancouver. And previously, he has worked as a policy officer at the European Commission, where he helped implement the European Union's carbon market. And he will talk today about clean energy jobs in a net zero world. And with this, I'll hand it over to Stefan. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. So let me share my screen here. All right. So thanks a lot for this introduction to today's webinar on clean energy jobs in a net zero world. Before we begin, let me tell you a little bit about Clean Energy Canada. We are a climate and energy think tank and an initiative at the Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. Simon Fraser University is based in British Columbia, as Alex mentioned, and we are a group of around 15 people, and we're all spread out all across Canada, from the west coast to the east. So I am based in Vancouver. I have 3 other colleagues who are also based here. And then, like I said, from west coast to the east, we're spread out. What is our mission and how do we work as an organization? So basically, we work towards accelerating the transition to clean energy in Canada. And we do that with a combination of strategies. So we carry out original research. We also convene dialogues with other interest groups from industry and the environmental community, governments, and we also inform governments of our research, and we provide our advice. And we do that on the federal level in Canada, but also the provincial level and sometimes even the municipal level. And on top of all that, we try to influence the discourse in Canada through providing really all of our major reports are geared towards the general public. Yeah. So today I'm going to talk about clean energy jobs, or let's say actually more about energy jobs in general. And my talk will proceed in 2 parts. So the first part will focus on what's happening globally. So I will talk about the global energy transition that we're witnessing right now, and that is also still a work in progress. And I will talk about what the energy sector looks like globally in terms of employment. And then I'll move to a case study or an example of a major oil producing nation, Canada, and talk about what could the energy sector in Canada look like in a net zero future. So let's begin with the global picture. So this is a graph from the International Energy Agency, and I will draw extensively on their work during this hour. This shows us employment globally in the energy sector over the recent past. And it shows us that clean energy jobs have recently overtaken jobs in fossil fuels worldwide. So on the right side, you see the scale for this line. And since 2019, we actually have more than 50% of employment in the energy sector globally comes from the clean energy sector. And the gray bar here, 2020, is the IEA didn't have such good estimates for that year. It's obviously the pandemic year. So that's why this one is grayed out here. And this is a bit of a further breakdown of this. This is basically a regional breakdown of what jobs in the energy sector look like globally. And you can see that in all regions around the world, there are now more clean energy jobs than fossil fuel energy jobs, except in Africa and especially in the Middle East and Eurasia, where there's still a lot of fossil fuel jobs out of the total energy jobs. But even there, recent announcements of clean energy projects in regions like the Middle East, for example, green hydrogen projects, they suggest that we can also expect the share of clean energy jobs to increase, even in regions where the energy sector has traditionally been dominated by jobs in oil and gas. And when we look at commitments around the world, governmental commitments to net zero, to achieving net zero, it's actually today 92% of global GDP is covered by net zero commitments. Most of them are for net zero 2050, but there are also some for 2060 or 70. 88% of global emissions are basically covered under net zero commitments. And this includes major economies like the US. So the US has a net zero commitment for 2050. The European Union has a net zero commitment also for 2050. And China, here on my slide, it says the world's most populous country, but I think it has now recently been overtaken by India, but still one of the absolutely largest in terms of population in the world. They have right now a commitment of net zero by 2060. But this is a good opportunity to really think about for a moment, okay, what is actually net zero? What does it mean? So basically, it's likely not possible to reduce all carbon pollution to zero. So there's a chart here on the right side. It's an illustration essentially of what a net zero future could look like in terms of emissions. So this is for net zero 2050. You see that the red line, which is the net emissions line, meets zero at 2050. So basically the purple part, they're here, it's titled gross emissions. So basically these are the emissions that come from the transportation sector, from industry, from buildings, and from the energy production. So these are the emissions that we release into the atmosphere. And at the end, towards 2050, you will see that there is some green part that goes into negative. So these are negative emissions, basically that count, they take emissions from the atmosphere and to counter the remaining few gross emissions that we likely will still need to emit in a net zero future. And then if you balance those two out, gross versus the plus versus the minus, then you get the net emissions. And the reason for this likely need for negative emissions is basically that some sectors, in some sectors, reducing emissions is extremely expensive or could be technically even impossible. And possible negative emissions solutions, they would basically remove the carbon pollution that's already in the atmosphere, remove it from the atmosphere and store it underground, for example. And there are some technology-based negative emission solutions that are, there's one called the direct air capture, or DAC also. And if you add the S, then it becomes, for storage, it becomes DACs. So this is a technology that captures CO2 from the ambient air and stores it underground. Then we have bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is also often called BECCS. This one is basically you take forest material or biomass material, bioenergy, and you combust that, you burn it, like for example, to create electricity and heat. And these emissions are captured and prevented from being released to the atmosphere, and you store them again underground. And there are also nature-based solutions to create negative emissions, basically forests. So we could leverage the ability of forests to act as a carbon sink to cancel out these remaining gross emissions. But it's really important to be aware that most emissions reductions, the purple part, are really to come from zero emission technologies, because they're likely it's much cheaper to use. And that's the focus really of a net zero future. And now let's think about what meeting net zero would mean. What does it mean for our energy supply? This is again at the global level. This is a scenario of what energy supply could look like in a net zero 2050 future. On the left side, we see, on the left side of the dotted line is basically how historically in the past the world has produced energy. And to the right side would be how it could look like in a net zero future. So globally, the International Energy Agency estimates that renewables and nuclear will need to displace most fossil fuel use to achieve those net zero emissions. And the share of fossil fuels would plunge from almost 80% in 2021 to less than 20% in 2050. Here is another look at this. So on the left side, you have basically fossil fuels that are not captured by any carbon capture and storage solutions. And you see that over time in this net zero future, they decline to almost zero. And on the right side, we have zero and low emissions technologies, a whole variety that includes renewables, biomass, there's some carbon capture and storage in there for some fossil fuels. Basically, as you can see, basically some fossil fuels are still used in 2050, and that's basically in the production of non-energy goods, for example, asphalt, or in facilities equipped with carbon capture and storage to prevent those emissions from being released to the atmosphere, and in sectors where emissions are difficult to reduce, and that's, for example, in aviation or cement production. And those remaining fossil fuels are then compensated with removals of emissions from the atmosphere. Now, on this slide, this one shows us over the past just under a decade or so, how much has the world invested in the energy sector? And this is broken down by clean energy investments and investments in fossil fuels. So the light green is clean energy investments, and you can see that more or less the fossil fuel investments have somewhat trended downwards over the last decade or so, although a small resurgence in the last 3-4 years. But the overall trend here is a decline. And then you see clean energy since more or less like 2020, even 2019 has vastly outpaced the investments that were made in fossil fuels. So there's a clear trend here that shows us that the world is investing much more in clean energy technologies. And this one breaks down the clean energy investments further into where do these go. And we can see that renewables and electric vehicles, they are basically leading in recent growth of clean energy investments. So the ones that grow them the strongest right now are renewables and electric vehicles. And on this slide, I'll talk for the next few slides a little bit more about renewables and electric vehicles. So here we see basically annual capacity additions around the world for renewables versus all other electricity generation sources. So the blue stuff is renewables capacity additions, and underneath this chart at the bottom, there's some pie charts that show you also what is the share in that year of how many capacity additions came about. And yeah, you can clearly see this strong rise in capacity additions. This is even over 20 years, actually. Goes back to 2002. And last year, the IEA, International Energy Agency, said that in the next 5 years, the world is set to add as much renewable power as the world has in the last 20 years. So there's a huge acceleration in this renewables deployment around the world. And this expected increase is actually 30% higher than what the IEA had forecast just a year before that. So it's really outpacing expectation, really, these renewables, the growth in renewables. And it's not only the capacity additions that are growing. What's also a really great development is that the costs of renewables continue to tumble. So you see here on the right side, there's a chart that shows so-called levelized cost of electricity. This is a measure to indicate the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity from, in this case here, we show renewable sources. So the yellow is concentrated solar power, the purple is solar PV, and you can see that in the bottom, basically the legend is there. This is over the last 10 years. And yeah, the costs have been plunging. And on the left side, I added some, these are some couple of headlines from articles on Bloomberg Green. And, you know, Germany has brought forward their renewable power goal and basically really counting on the expansion of wind and solar. And geopolitics has also, of course, played a big factor in this development recently, so that basically nations around the world are really reevaluating their energy plans right now. Wind energy is set to play a key role in the European Union's climate plans as well. Now I'll focus a little bit on electric vehicles around the world. So this is over the last 12 years, goes back to 2010, and shows us what is the share of electric vehicles in new passenger vehicles sold. So this is globally again, and out of all the passenger vehicles sold, for example, last year, 2022, 14% of those were electric vehicles around the world. Obviously, there are massive regional differences. Some regions have way more, other, like in Norway or where I live, British Columbia. We have last year in British Columbia, we had over 18% of vehicles sold were electric vehicles. Norway has even much larger. I don't have the numbers with me right now, but I want to say something like 80%. I don't know if that might be even like vehicle stock on the road. But in any case, Norway is #1 EV share in the world. But regardless, you can see the trend here. It goes from practically zero to, this is an exponential curve here. And this global uptake has, similarly to renewables, actually outpaced projections that were previously made. So in 2020, the International Energy Agency projected that the global share of EV sales would not be more than 10% before the end of this decade. And we just saw that it's been already, last year it was 14, or what was it, 14, 16%. So, and now analysts like Bloomberg NEF are now projecting that the market share of EVs will actually approach 40% by the end of the decade. So Similarly to renewables, growth in these clean energy solutions is massively outpacing expectation. And now let's look at for a moment again at the big picture here. So despite progress in a lot of areas, the world is currently not yet on track to meeting its net zero commitments. Take a look at this graph from the IEA. It shows you on the left side different pathways for global emissions depending on different scenarios. And on the right side, it shows us what each scenario means in terms of global temperature rise. So the red line on the left, pre-Paris baseline, shows where the world was headed before the Paris Agreement. And that blue line, steps means the stated policy scenario. That is the world's current trajectory if there is no additional policy action taken. And APS, yellow, this is the announced pledges scenario, assumes that all targets that governments have promised are met on time and in full. And that will be backed up by policy action. And then the green part, the green curve, net zero emissions, NZE, shows us the path that we need to be on to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And that would give the world a good chance to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So what does this mean? It means that governments around the world basically need to step up their efforts to live up to their commitments that they have made. So more action is needed in all areas, like energy supply, how we produce our energy, transportation sector emissions need to go down, heavy industry, buildings, agriculture. It means that we do need more clean electricity, we need even more zero emission vehicles, and we need more clean hydrogen and so on. All these clean energy solutions, much more of that is needed. And that way, people around the world can really reap all the benefits that come from a net zero future. So this was the current global picture. Now I want to move to part 2 in my talk. And we at Clean Energy Canada, we looked at what the energy transition means for Canada's energy economy, specifically what it means for jobs in the energy sector. Some of you may know this, Canada is actually number 4 on the list of oil-producing nations in the world. That's ahead of Iraq, Iran, China, Brazil, and others. So as a major fossil fuel producer today, what will happen to Canadian jobs in the clean energy and fossil fuel sectors as the world shifts to net zero? Like, that is the question that we asked ourselves. So that's what we wanted to model together with a company called Navius Research. And this work that we did resulted in our new report, A Pivotal Moment. You see the cover on the right-hand side. And we published this report in March. And this was actually the 4th report in a series. We've actually been we've been exploring jobs in the clean energy sector for a number of years now, always based on economic modeling. And our latest report, though, is the first one that looks all the way to 2050. And 2050 is the year by which Canada also has committed to achieving net zero, together with more than 130 other countries in the world. 2050, other countries have also promised net zero, but for later years, so not as ambitious. And by 2050, the required uptake in clean technologies needs to have transformed our energy economy to enable this transition to net zero. So that's why we looked at 2050 here. And first, I want to explain how in this work we defined the clean energy sector. So jobs in the clean energy sector cut across a wide range of areas and regions in Canada. Essentially, the clean energy sector concerns all aspects that make up a net zero economy. It includes electric vehicles and their components, like batteries, for example. It includes clean electricity supply and transmission, because also we need to integrate our electricity grid much more to leverage better our renewables. And so transmission is a very important part as well in the supply equation. It also includes the construction of energy efficient buildings. And for industry, it includes, for example, carbon capture and storage solutions, bioenergy, clean hydrogen, and a lot more. And the economic activity in the clean energy sector includes three categories in our work. So first, we include direct employment. So for example, generating electricity from a wind turbine. We also include jobs in construction and services. So for example, building a wind farm. And third, we include manufacturing jobs. So for example, people that manufacture the components for wind turbines. So we include both direct and indirect jobs in this work. And it's a broad definition. And we also define the fossil fuel sector broadly to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. So for example, in the same way that we include electric vehicle related jobs in the clean energy sector, we also include jobs related to gasoline and diesel vehicles in the fossil fuel sector. Now let's look at the scenarios that we modeled in this work. Our first scenario, and that's our main scenario, in that one, Canada reaches net zero emissions by 2050. And it does that in the most cost-efficient way. So the least costly pathway to net zero emissions to the Canadian economy. We also modeled a current policy scenario. That one assumes that no additional policy action is taken after 2030. So we already have a number of policies in place right now and scheduled to be introduced by the end of this decade. But this scenario, the current policy scenario, assumes that there's no additional policies after 2030. And the policies that are in this package, I included the most significant ones in the blue box here. So there is a federal carbon price in place today already at $65, and it will schedule to rise to 170 by the end of this decade. And this carbon price applies to industrial facilities and also applies to household consumers for the fossil fuels they consume at the pump. There's also another policy in place called the Clean Fuel Regulations that is to reduce the carbon intensity of transportation fuels. And then we have a policy package. It's called the 2030 Emissions Reduction Plan. That one has a series of policies in it that will help Canada reach 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by the end of this decade. So the current policy scenario consists of a number of policies, and the main ones are these. But what's important to know is that this scenario is not sufficient for Canada to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And the third scenario modeled is it contemplates what would happen if a future government came in and rolled back some of our most impactful climate policies, specifically undoing Canada's carbon price, clean fuel regulations, and the 2030 emissions reduction plan. So that's what the third one is looking at. And all our scenarios assume that the world achieves net zero in 2050. So the IEA estimates in its net zero scenario that oil prices would fall below $30 US per barrel by 2050. And you can see here this chart, or is the what is this turquoise part on the left is basically historical oil price, and then the green part towards the right is what the IEA estimates oil prices to look like in a net zero scenario. And the Canada Energy Regulator, that's a government agency, is also going to use the IEA's oil price in its net zero scenario in its upcoming Energy Future report. And that one is actually coming out tomorrow. And just last week, the IEA said that the shift to clean energy is picking up pace so much that a peak in global oil demand is in sight before the end of this decade, as electric vehicles, energy efficiency, and other technologies are advancing. So the IEA thinks that we're advancing so much at the moment on clean energy that actually global oil demand is going to peak before the end of this decade. And these are our main takeaways from our modeling work. So first one is Canada will see 700,000 more energy jobs in 2050 than we have today if countries achieve their stated climate goals of net zero. And the key difference here is that most energy jobs will be in clean energy rather than fossil fuel energy. Essentially, it means that growth in clean energy jobs is outpacing the decline in fossil fuel jobs. And 700,000 jobs in Canada, that's a lot. Today, we have around 2.8 million total energy jobs. So 2.8 million total energy jobs today. And it means that there would be a quarter of today's energy sector workforce added in Canada by 2050. The other takeaway is that rolling back climate action will actually weaken the energy sector and lead to fewer overall energy jobs. And that's because global demand for fossil fuels, including Canadian oil, is expected to decline strongly in a net zero future. And that means that even if we walked back our climate efforts with a change of government, Canada would not be able to protect the oil sands from this inevitable global energy transition. And lastly, the clean energy sector is a diverse cross-Canada employer, and this represents a truly pan-Canadian opportunity. Alberta's clean energy sector in particular is set to grow by 10% per year out to a net zero 2050. And that is the strongest growth of any province or territory. In fact, there will be even more total energy jobs in the province of Alberta than there are today, with clean energy job growth outpacing fossil fuel losses. Canada-wide, in our net zero scenario, there will be almost 3 million clean energy jobs in 2050. That's more jobs than we have in the fossil fuel sector today. And the GDP contribution of the clean energy sector will rise to over $500 billion. The clean transportation industry is set to become the biggest clean energy sector in Canada, accounting for more than 60% of clean energy jobs by 2050. And almost 500,000 people will be employed to supply clean energy in Canada by mid-century. This chart shows you basically jobs in the clean energy sector making up for the declines in fossil fuel sector. So here you see how this works out over time. You have the turquoise part in the top, which is the clean energy jobs, how they're added year over year or in 5-year increments here, shown in 5-year increments. And The darker parts are those jobs that decline in the traditional fossil fuel sector. And you can see that there are more jobs in clean energy added than those that decline in the fossil fuel sector. And here's another way of showing this shift to clean energy jobs. Looking at the energy sector as a whole, we see a decline of 1.5 million jobs in the fossil fuel economy. That's in the middle here, this black part. But this decline is far exceeded by an increase of 2.2 million jobs in the clean energy sector. So that on balance, it means that we have an overall increase of the 700,000 energy jobs by 2050. And we also wanted to see what would happen to jobs in the energy sector if we were to roll back some of our most important major climate policies. And we found that doing this will not create a stronger energy sector. Instead, it would actually stifle growth in the clean energy sector to such an extent that there would be 100,000 fewer overall energy jobs in 2050. Our report also includes regional breakdowns for all regions across Canada in our net zero scenario. I'll just mention some highlights here. So all regions, meaning all provinces and in the territories. So in Alberta, that's currently Canada's biggest oil and gas producing province. Jobs in carbon capture and storage for industry are set to grow by a factor of 10 between 2025 and 2050, with almost 40,000 Albertans employed in 2050. Clean hydrogen production in Alberta has some of the most impressive growth of any clean industry in the country. And it's set to grow around 40% per year between 2025 and 2050 to eventually employ 2/3 of the Canadian clean hydrogen production total. That would be around 9,000 workers from close to 0 to 9,000 by 2050. And jobs in new renewables in Alberta are projected to increase by 70% between 2025 and 2050. So these are some highlights from Alberta. Moving on to Ontario, that's Canada's most populous province. Jobs in electric vehicles are on track to grow 17% per year, employing almost 450,000 people in a net zero 2050. And that's up from less than 10,000 in 2025. So huge growth in electric vehicles in Ontario. Low carbon steel is also an industry primed for growth in a net zero world. And it's set to be as much as an employer as big as, jobs are growing from close to 0 to more than 7,000 jobs in 2050. And in Quebec, that's Canada's second largest province in terms of population. Jobs related to high efficiency heating, ventilation, and air conditioning would grow 8% per year, employing more than 22,000 people by mid-century. And there would be over 55,000 workers in the construction of energy efficient building shells. So these are some examples and highlights from all across Canada. And I will close with some recommendations. So first, we need to really continue putting in place strong policies that rapidly drive forward the clean energy transition. So it means in Canada, for example, to implement our 2030 emissions reduction plan. But governments at all levels must do more to ensure that we achieve a net zero economy by 2050. So more policy action is needed to leverage this, to really get to the core of this massive opportunity. And secondly, we need to prepare our workforce for the huge increase in clean energy jobs and these high-skilled opportunities that this new energy economy brings. So preparing the workforce, hugely important topic. And third, Canada needs to invest in these new industries like electric vehicle manufacturing, batteries, sustainable mining, hydrogen, clean electricity, and so on. And finally, we need to ensure that no one is left behind in this energy transition while there's still time to make it a smooth transition. So we need to empower workers and their communities so that Canada makes the most of this net zero opportunity. Now, I know this was a lot of information, but I wanted to give you a sense of the enormous opportunities of a net zero future and what this could look like and how it could play out for a major fossil fuel producer like Canada. And now I look forward to any questions or comments anyone may have and to discussing this topic further.
Thank you. That was extremely interesting. Super exciting talk. Do you have any questions?
I have a question. What are the long-term effects of storing carbon underground? It reminds me of dropping barrels to the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the parallels between those two, but so there are studies that suggest that with rigorous monitoring, verification, and reporting requirements, it should be possible. It depends on in which geological formations do you store, and there's still research ongoing, but it appears technically feasible to store the CO2 potentially for like 1,000 years or longer, depending on where you put it and how rigorous is your regulatory framework to make sure that the stuff actually stays there. So, I mean, there are always still some question marks, but and it's also not something that it's happening around the world. There are some projects that are doing that, but we're still collecting evidence on how well it works. But research does suggest that it's possible to do this, and of course, it's very important to make sure this is permanent sequestration. And you know, there are also some people who are really would like to focus on carbon capture and utilization. So this would be you capture carbon, and then instead of storing it permanently, you would maybe use it to either produce more oil, which obviously is actually not beneficial for the climate. So this is called enhanced oil recovery, which has been actually happening for many decades already. This is a proven technology, but it's not a clean energy solution. It's not a solution to help us achieve net zero emissions. So what we really need to do is capture it and store it permanently. So it's an important question. So it's a good point that you raised.
Stefan, this is Peter. I got a question as well about in your assessment of the jobs for Canada. Does nuclear play a role? There is a little bit of a growth, as you pointed out, in the nuclear field, and I assume that depends a little bit what some countries are doing, and I assume it's mostly based on light water reactors. But Canada is a big player in CANDU reactors. Do you foresee lots of orders for that, and what does it mean for the workforce in that area?
So I think our modeling shows for Canada that nuclear continues to play a role, more or less at the level that we see it today. It doesn't show us a crazy expansion, but there is already, I think it's around 15% of electricity produced in Canada is from nuclear, and that's all in Ontario and New Brunswick. And there is this is conventional nuclear technology. There is also a technology that is still being developed. It's called small modular reactors, or SMRs, nuclear SMRs. These are still at the prototype stage, so aren't commercially available or mature enough yet. It could be that, so depending on how they develop, it could be that we would see more from those. So, but clearly, most of the energy, most of the electricity additions in generation and capacity additions in Canada are likely to come from renewables. But nuclear, I think, will continue to play a role because it's another basically low carbon and the corresponding jobs that come with it.
Thank you. And maybe one additional question, if I may. So what you're saying is that you have essentially a job growth due to renewables, or there's a net growth in employees in the energy sector, right? Due to that. And now that would in turn also mean that the costs of energy productions in the future will be higher than it currently is, because if you're employing more people with more or less similar production of energy, that means the costs go up, right? Is that true or is that not true?
So based on our work, I'm not able to say that. We don't have that data, but I would also think that another factor here at play is energy efficiency. So, and also the decline of electricity production costs that we expect would continue for some time. So I'm not necessarily, I wouldn't be too sure about this. Yeah, but I can't say definitively based on our work.
Yeah, interesting. And in the energy sector, production does obviously that includes the mining and what have you, right?
Let me go back to the slide.
The mining jobs.
So we're talking about sustainable mining here. So I mean, mining is important for basically it's important for electric vehicle batteries, for example. Let me see. I think mining is actually, where do we have it? I imagine it would be in clean industry, because it would be the materials that we produce to use. Yeah, but yeah, part of a net zero economy is indeed the ability to produce those electric vehicles and the batteries, and they do need these critical minerals.
Yeah, I guess it would be interesting if the energy production costs are reducing, or the raw materials costs are reducing stronger than the labor costs, because you do have more employees, and if it becomes in zero-sum game, or if that's the employee numbers are in fact the reason why renewables may be more expensive or not. It could be.
Yeah, that's a really good question to explore. We will actually release a report in the fall on the question of affordability, which is on everybody's mind in the recent past, and what clean energy solutions can do for households, because a lot of these technologies are actually they could help affordability pressures, depending on also policy design. If you design policy to help people install more heat pumps, they have more upfront cost, but over the lifetime of the heat pump, you will recover more than what you put in, so that in the end, over the lifetime of a heat pump, you save so much compared to a natural gas boiler or something. So watch out for a report coming in the fall on affordability and climate solutions.
That's actually, sorry to hog your time here, but one more question associated with that. In these calculations, do you consider the capital costs as well? So, yes, it's true that you have to have the upfront investment costs, but you have costs associated with raising that money as well. Is that included?
Absolutely. This is a general computable equilibrium model from Navius research, and it has a detailed accounting of all the different cost factors of clean and fossil fuel technologies, and it does include operating and upfront expenditures, capital expenditure, operating expenditure, everything. So it's a really complex model, and it's able to represent very well the energy economy.
Yes, thanks.
I have a question. Do you have statistics on where in Canada those jobs will be?
Yeah, absolutely. Our report has regional breakdowns. So let me just go back to my slide. This is just an example of a regional breakdown for Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec. We don't have.
I was more thinking about between, white and First Nation and Indigenous, etc., etc.
Right. So, for example, within the province, actually, I was just thinking a more regional breakdown than that, or in terms of geography or population. We don't have that level of detail. Yeah. We have province, but it's not broken down further than that. No.
Because when you say nobody left behind, that made me think about the north of Canada.
Yeah, it's a very, very important topic. This is like, it shows us the opportunity, and also that we need to really make sure that we have people with the required skills available to fill these positions. And the federal government in Canada has just tabled a bill at the end of last week for a Sustainable Jobs Act that is exactly grappling with this question: how do we prepare our workforce for a net zero future? So there's ongoing work, and it's very important.
I also have a question.
Yeah, sure.
I'd just like to know, when you're talking about the upskilling, was there plans to look at what should be in place? Maybe a study to look from moving from unskilled and to upskilled jobs.
Yeah, that's a very interesting area of research. The federal government is looking at that. There's a process underway where the federal government connects with each province to figure out what are the basically prime opportunities for this province to benefit from a net zero economy. And so, it's basically like they're doing a similar process where they think about what is this region already good at, and where is the growth likely to continue, and how do we then make sure the workforce in this area can, and in some cases, like in Alberta, for example, there are already a lot of existing skills in the oil and gas industry that can be leveraged for example, these carbon capture and storage solutions in industry, where you already have a lot of skills that are very transferable, or for clean hydrogen production, adding this capture part to existing facilities. So it's a very important topic, and there's good work underway, and we're keeping tabs on how this work is going.
I have a question. So you mentioned that the International Energy Association has predicted that the peak oil demand will happen within the next few years. So shouldn't that lead to a massive divestment in the fossil fuel sector and a huge shift to the clean energy sector, and even accelerate things? Are these mechanisms part of your scenarios, of your calculations?
Yeah, you're right. You would expect the financial markets and the energy markets to kind of anticipate those things. So it could be that there would be a bit of a an effect of things could kind of go quickly at some point. In our modeling, this should be part of it for sure. So like these effects of shifting employment and GDP contributions and what it then, the whole reshuffling stuff. This is what this computable general equilibrium model is really good at representing. But we'll see. I mean, it would be great news for a net zero future if we would reach a tipping point in that sense sooner than later.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, one more. Well, I keep reading. I don't know if that's true, and I'd like to know whether you think it's true or not. That most jobs in the United States, at least, will be in the electrical sector.
I don't have like up-to-date statistics or data for the US.
But how is it in Canada?
So I mean, based on our work, the energy supply sector, and that includes electricity, is said to be a pretty big employer, along with others like especially the electric vehicles sector. And that also includes hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, especially for heavy duty transportation vehicles. So I think it's going to be, but it's true. I mean, Canada will definitely need a lot of clean electricity because we are trying to electrify the transportation sector. And so there's going to be more electricity demand from transportation. And we're also trying to electrify more and more industries. So you would think, and that's also what our work shows, that the energy supply sector, including electricity, is primed for growth for sure, yeah.
Okay. There are no more questions. I would like to thank you one more time for this wonderful talk. Definitely a very exciting future ahead of us with all these transformations and transitions. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Dankeschön.
Thanks for your interest.
Thank you.
And don't
Thank
forget
you.
to register for the audit this fall, October 7th in Los Angeles. There will be more discussion around that topic. Hope to see you all there. Danke.
Okay, ciao, danke.
Ciao.